Hi everyone, welcome to this English 7A flipped preview video for lessons 3.01 through 3.4, readings that inform. Let's start off with this question. What kind of qualities or characteristics are necessary in order to achieve challenging things? Can you think about a time in your life where you had to do something really hard and you finally got through it or you finally accomplished something? What were some qualities or characteristics or even people who were involved in helping make that successful? Maybe you can't think of something in your own life. Maybe it's a famous person who did something in order to overcome obstacles and challenges to be successful. I know for me, I think right off the bat of Michael Jordan, which is a classic story that we hear of the hard work and dedication that Michael Jordan put into his basketball career to ultimately be one of the most famous and best basketball players in the NBA. So, anyways, think about that question as we dive into these lessons. In this lesson video, I want to talk to you about the genre of narrative nonfiction and historical fiction. We're going to look at the author's viewpoint and tone in a text. And then we're going to just do a brief overview of the different texts that are in these lessons in order to prepare for the upcoming lesson that goes along with this flipped preview video. All right, so when reading an informational text, you will notice that there are a lot of ideas and details. So think about the author's purpose in an informational text is to what? Inform. Okay, so there's different purposes when writing that an author has. It could be to persuade, to inform, to entertain. But when reading informational text, keep in mind that the author's purpose is to inform. Now, there are three big keywords that I want you to keep in mind as we talk about these texts. The first one is central idea. Now, central idea is the main idea or message in a text. That's something that we talk about a lot. We did a whole lesson on it in the beginning of this course, English 7A, when we talked about central idea and theme. It's the main idea or message that the author wants to get across. Don't confuse it with theme, which is more so seen in fictional readings. I also want to highlight explicit. All right, so explicit is something information that is directly stated in a text. So sometimes we have to make inferences in a text, which means that things are not directly stated. We have to use our information, context clues to come up with something. But explicit is when something is stated clearly in detail in a text. And as always, we're always talking about textual evidence. Evidence is textual details that can support an interpretation or analysis. In English class, at this point, hopefully you're used to the idea of textual evidence. We always want to think about how can we use evidence from the text to really support our responses. All right, now in these lessons, we're reading texts that inform. And I really want to point your attention to two different genres. The first one is narrative nonfiction. Now, this is a type of genre where it's a narrative based on factual material told using the same literary techniques as fictional stories. Remember back in in Unit 2, and specifically lesson 2.16, where you wrote your own fictional narrative. This is very similar, but remember with nonfiction, we're using real events, people, places, and sometimes things, but we might be mixing them to create a narrative, which means we might have dialogue, we might have a clear setting. Okay, the other genre I want to point your attention to in these lessons is historical fiction. This is a literary genre that's set in the past, and it's characterized by fictional reconstructions of historical events and people. So the historical fiction attempts to transport readers back in time or back to another place. You might have real people, but some of the events might be made up, or vice versa. You might have real events, but you might have made up people involved. So pay attention to these genres as you're working through your lessons. All right, so since we were talking about narratives, it's important that we review some narrative elements, okay? So let's review. What is plot? Well, the plot includes real and fictional events, but it generally remains true to the time period. So specifically referring to historical fiction and narrative nonfiction. Characters. Okay, now characters, some or all the characters may be fictional in these genres, but all must be realistic for the period of history, the period of time. Dialogue. We're very familiar with dialogue. This is going to be the thoughts and words of the characters that are realistic for the time period, but created by the author. So they may not have actually said it, but it's realistic. We don't have any maybe accounts of what was said in that moment, but an author can create dialogue that would be realistic for that moment based off of other historical artifacts. All right, and then we have conflict. Remember, the conflict, it's a problem that the characters are involved with, and the conflict must be realistic for the time period. All right, so those are some reviews for narratives and some of our fictional parts of these genres. Okay, you'll also need to know these two terms, which is a review, but let's review. A biography and autobiography. What's the difference between the two? Think about it for a second. Quiz, do you know? All right, I'm going to take a guess. You did. Maybe you were unsure. Let's review real quick. Biography, it's a text written about someone's life by someone other than the person's life. So if somebody wrote a book about my life, they would be writing a biography. Now, an autobiography, if you break that word, auto means self, it's a root word. That's a fun little side lesson, prefixes, roots. Auto, it means self. So then an autobiography is one written about a person's life by that person. So if I wrote a story about my life, that would be an autobiography. It's also important to look at, as you're reading these texts and these lessons, different features of informational text, such as titles. Pay attention to the titles, the headers, the footnotes, the pictures, the visuals, and the captions. These are things that as you're reviewing the text before you read it, maybe you're making some predictions, right? We always want to preview our readings before we dive in, make some predictions, try to interact with the text, make some connections. Is there something that jumps out to you? Maybe there's a heading that really catches your eye that you want to learn more about, or maybe there was an image that really drew you in. Make those connections before diving into reading, or during reading, or even after reading. Those are some great reading strategies to keep in mind. All right, so now let's dive into who are we learning about? What are these readings informing us about? So the story in lesson 3.01, there are actually two texts that you will read. They both are based on true historical events. In 1893, a guy named Dr. Williams really did perform the first open heart surgery on a man, uh, which is quite outstanding. So keep that in mind. It's a real thing that happened, a real doctor that really did that. But remember those genres that we talked about. All right, it's also important to think about the setting of the two texts in this lessons. So think about what setting of these two texts, what was it? Where were it? Where was it happening? When was it happening? The setting is America, okay, after the Civil War. So historically, this is where our country was. It meant that racism was prevalent, which made it difficult for African Americans to achieve or attain the same sort of things at this time period as the whites in America. So keep that setting in mind. It's really important. That helps drive some of the conflict, the plot, and the central ideas located in these texts. So let's look a little bit more in this video about Daniel Hay Williams, Dr. Williams. Who was he? How can we describe his type or character? All right, he was the first doctor to successfully perform open heart surgery, making him a pioneer in his field. Now, keep this in mind. A pioneer, what is a pioneer? A pioneer, it means that it's a person who is among the first to explore or settle a new country or area, or in this case, we're talking about in his field of medical or science. Okay, so the two texts that you explore, consider the differences between these two texts and the differing viewpoints of the authors. They're both about the same person, Dr. Williams, but one text is more for entertainment, still to inform, while the other is more for just informing the audience. Both texts have a tone that is admirable, and remember, the tone is the author's viewpoint on the subject or topic. All right, we talk a lot about tone. Tone is the author's viewpoint on the subject or topic. When you're being asked in your lessons or on quizzes to identify a tone of a text, I always like to think about this question. How does the author feel about this? That usually helps me identify a tone of a text. All right, now let's jump into lesson 3.02. In this lesson, we again read two texts about a scientist, Marie Curie. Her story is very fascinating because she overcame a lot of obstacles to achieve her success. Remember that question I asked you at the beginning? What types of qualities, characteristics, or people have to be in your life in order to achieve and overcome obstacles in your life? I think you'll really like this story if that's something that really resonates with you. Her determination and passion, those might be two characteristics, helped lead her to her discovery of radium, which was a huge scientific breakthrough at the time. Now let's jump into lesson 3.03. In this lesson, you will read an article about a young woman named Kate Bauman. She was a doctoral student, meaning she was earning her doctorate degree in a specific field. She had already gone to college for 4 years for her bachelor's degree, probably. She had her master's degree, and now she was earning her doctorate degree. She helped lead the creation of an algorithm or a set of calculations 3 years ago to help us see an image of a black hole in space. I actually do believe this was in the year 2015, so we might be a little beyond 3 years by now. But it's very important to note the interactions between individuals, events, and ideas in this text. Keep that in mind as you're reading or rereading this text. What are the interactions between individuals, events, and ideas? And how can that help contribute to the big idea of the text? And again, big idea, central idea, that main message that the author is trying to get across. And lastly, in lesson 3.04, you're going to take some time comparing the informational text found in lessons 3.01, 3.02, and 3.03. Remember, the purpose the author has when writing informational text is to inform. And we know that because of the factual information that is presented throughout informational texts. Thanks everyone for watching this video. I look forward to jumping into the lesson that follows this flipped preview video. Happy learning, everyone. Sincerely, Mrs. A.